Welcome to the Thrill Quests channel, where mysteries come alive. I'm Annabelle, your guide through a labyrinth of suspense and intrigue. Get ready to elevate your senses, grip the edge of your seat, and prepare to embark on a journey into the unknown. Every story is a new thrill, every quest a new adventure. So, are you ready to unlock the mysteries that lie ahead? Let the quest for thrills begin. Shadows of Greenwich. The sun cast long shadows on the cobblestone streets of Greenwich, Connecticut, as a group of college-bound students arrived at the grand, yet slightly decrepit Victorian house of Mrs. Agatha Miller. Eager to bolster their college applications, they had signed up to volunteer, unaware that their philanthropic gesture would lead them into a decades-old mystery. The group consisted of the confident and adventurous head counselor Jake Ace Miller, the sharp-witted and resourceful Emily M. Carter, the laid-back joker Brian Turbo Thompson, the quiet and observant Claire Whiz Wilson, and the analytical and cautious pre-med student Michael Mike Davis. As they stepped onto the porch, a sense of foreboding settled over them, though they couldn't quite place why. Mrs. Agatha Miller, a frail yet sprightly woman in her late 70s, greeted them with a warm smile. Her eyes, however, held a certain depth that suggested she had witnessed much in her lifetime. She guided the group through her house, explaining the tasks they were to complete. They were to clean the attic, a space that hadn't been touched since her late husband's passing 30 years ago. As they climbed the creaky staircase to the attic, Em couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. "This place gives me the creeps," she whispered to Ace. "Come on, it's just an old house. Let's get this done," Ace replied, trying to sound confident. The attic was a treasure trove of dusty relics and forgotten memories. As they began to clean, Turbo discovered an old trunk tucked away in a corner. "Hey, check this out," he called to the others. They gathered around as he opened the trunk, revealing a collection of yellowed letters, faded photographs, and a journal. Whiz carefully picked up the journal, noticing the name Edward Miller inscribed on the cover. "This must have belonged to Mrs. Miller's husband," she said. As they flipped through the journal, they discovered entries detailing Edward's life, his business dealings, and a series of increasingly desperate letters to loan sharks. The final entry, dated the day before his supposed death, hinted at a plan to escape his debts. "Guys, I think Edward might have faked his death," Em said, her eyes wide with realization. Intrigued by their discovery, the group continued to search the attic. They found a hidden compartment in the trunk, containing a photograph of Edward with another man who looked strikingly similar to him. On the back of the photograph, the name Elias Miller was written. "Who is Elias Miller?" Ace wondered aloud. "I bet he's Edward's twin brother," Mike theorized. It would explain why the body they found was so easily identified as Edward's. The more they uncovered, the more they suspected that Mrs. Miller knew more about her husband's disappearance than she let on. They decided to confront her about their findings. Downstairs, Mrs. Miller was preparing tea when the group approached her. Em, trying to hide her nervousness, spoke up. "Mrs. Miller, we found some things in the attic. A journal, letters, and a photograph." Mrs. Miller's face paled as she looked at the items they presented. She took a deep breath before speaking. "I suppose it's time you knew the truth. Edward, he was desperate. His debts were overwhelming, and he saw no way out but to disappear. But the body they found," Whiz began. Mrs. Miller nodded. "Elias, his twin brother. Elias was always the black sheep of the family. He was in trouble with some dangerous people, and Edward saw an opportunity. He switched places with Elias, hoping that his brother's death would cover his own escape." The group was stunned. "So Edward is still alive?" Turbo asked. "I believe so," Mrs. Miller replied, her voice heavy with sorrow. "But I've never heard from him since that day." Determined to find the truth, the group continued their investigation. They found a letter hidden beneath the floorboards in the attic, addressed to Mrs. Miller. It was from Edward, dated a year after his disappearance. In the letter, Edward explained that he had fled to Canada, intending to start a new life. He expressed his regret for leaving his wife and promised to return once it was safe. However, the letter ended abruptly, hinting that he was being pursued by those he owed. The group knew they had to find Edward and bring closure to Mrs. Miller. Using the clues in the letter, they tracked down a small town in Canada where Edward might have settled. The journey to Canada was long and filled with anticipation. Upon arriving in the small town, they asked around for any information about Edward Miller. Most people shrugged, having never heard the name. Just as they were about to give up, an elderly shopkeeper recognized the photograph of Edward. He used to live here many years ago. Went by the name of Ed Mason, the shopkeeper said. With a renewed sense of purpose, the group followed the lead to a secluded cabin on the outskirts of town. There they found an elderly man who matched the photograph of Edward. Edward, now a frail old man, was taken aback when the group revealed who they were. Overwhelmed with emotion, he explained that he had been living in hiding, constantly looking over his shoulder for the loan sharks who once pursued him. "It's time to come home," Em said gently. With their help, Edward returned to Greenwich, where a tearful reunion with Mrs. Miller awaited. The couple embraced, their sorrow and joy intermingling as they reunited after 30 long years. The students, having unraveled the mystery, felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond their college applications. They had brought closure to a family and uncovered a truth that had been hidden for decades. As they stood on the porch of Mrs. Miller's house one last time, they reflected on the journey that had brought them closer together and changed their lives forever. Thanks for joining us on another thrilling quest. We hope you enjoyed unraveling today's mystery. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the Thrill Quests to keep the adventure alive. And remember, there's always another mystery waiting to be solved, so be sure to tune in for tomorrow's episode. Until then, stay curious and keep questing.